I speak to you today in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I want to share a story with you today, and it's one that a lot of you have probably heard me share before, maybe even more than once. But the reason why I want to share it again this morning, or today, is because it's a story that I think really has something to say to the reality that we find ourselves living in right now. Now, it's not my story, it's not my own experience, but it's a story that Rob Bell told. And it's a story I heard probably more than 5 years ago now. But it's one that still resonates with me because I think it's one that really speaks to and helps me to understand my own life and the things that I experience in life, both the good and the bad from a faith perspective. And so I want to share that story with you. There was this guy who went on a camping trip with his family a few years ago. It was at this cabin in the woods on the edge of this tiny lake deep in the middle of nowhere. Now, this guy, he said that one morning he woke up really early and he decided that he was going to take a walk around the lake. He said it was one of those mornings, not a cloud in the sky. There was a sheet of glass on the lake, not a ripple to be seen. The birds were just waking up and beginning to sing their songs. He said that it was one of those mornings that you wish you could just freeze. That it was so peaceful and so amazing that you simply wanted to be able to hold on to that moment forever. So he decided that he was going to take this walk around the lake, and he decided that he was going to take his one-year-old son with him. So he strapped his son into one of those hiking backpacks, flung the boy over his shoulders, and off they went on their adventure around the lake. When they got to the other side of the lake, exactly the halfway mark of their walk, the furthest possible point from the cabin, just as they were rounding the bend to come back down the other side of the lake, he looked up and he saw clouds. They seemed to have come out of nowhere. And then it started to rain. First, there was a drop here and a drop there, but then they started to get bigger and bigger, and they were falling faster and faster. And in no time, it was absolutely pouring, the kind of rain that drenches you to the bone in a matter of seconds. Now, at first, the thunder and the lightning doesn't seem to bother his son. At first, the little guy is doing okay, even though he's getting soaked. But as it picks up and gets louder and louder and the wind becomes more intense and the trees start to shake back and forth, he starts to get overwhelmed. He becomes more and more agitated. At first, there's a whimper, and then there's a little shout here and there. But in no time at all, that little guy was shrieking at the top of his lungs. He was absolutely terrified by that storm that was raging all around him. Now, later on, when that father had a chance to reflect on that experience, he said, my son, he could only see the storm that was raging all around him. But what he doesn't realize, what he didn't realize in that moment, was that as his dad, as his father, I would do absolutely anything and everything to get him home. So he stopped. He took his son out of the backpack. He pulled him close to his chest, and he wrapped his arms around him. And he held him as tight as he possibly could. And for the last mile of their walk that morning, he kept whispering into his ear. He kept whispering, I love you, buddy. We're gonna make it. Dad knows the way home. I love you, buddy. We're going to make it. Dad knows the way home. That story is a reflection not just of the kind of love that parents have for their children, but that story is a great example, a great illustration of the kind of love that God has for each one of us. It is a love that is so strong, so deep, that our God would do and has done anything and everything to get us home, to get you home. Because the reality, something we know all too well right now, because the reality is that sometimes it rains in our lives. Sometimes storms in our lives, sometimes they build gradually, and sometimes they come up out of nowhere. Sometimes we can go from having things in our life seem like they're so perfect and everything is falling into place to being in the midst of a raging storm in the blink of an eye. I think back to when I first realized that all of us were about to get caught in the storm of this pandemic. Because at first those storm clouds, they seemed so far off in the distance. They seemed like they were nowhere near us. Yes, we would hear news reports talking about a new virus making people sick in China. Yes, we would hear people speculating about whether or not this might become a pandemic and a global pandemic. In the beginning, we could see the clouds off in the distance, but they were far enough away that we didn't seem to feel the need to bring an umbrella with us everywhere we went. Then all of a sudden, everything changed. In the blink of an eye, the storm of this pandemic hit close to home. I remember I was on my way home from hockey one night when I first heard that the National Basketball Association was pausing their season because of this virus. My first thought in that moment was, thank God it's not hockey. But then the very next day, the National Hockey League announced that they were following suit. And then the rain really started coming down. Schools got canceled. Businesses were being forced to close. Masks were being put on by people. People were being told to stay home. Hospital rooms began to fill up. Long-term care homes got hit hard. And the death toll, it started to rise. It is in these kinds of moments that we have found ourselves living in. It is in these kind of moments when the only reality you can see is the thunder and the lightning and the wind and the rain, in those moments of our lives when we are hurting and when we are overwhelmed, when we are lost and alone, when we are soaking wet, when we are confused and afraid. Even when the only reality you can see in your life is the darkness of death that surrounds you. The resurrection of Jesus that we have been celebrating for the past 40 days. The discovery of the empty tomb that was made on that first Easter morning. All of the incredible stories that we have been hearing about Jesus appearing to his disciples after being raised from the dead. The good news of Easter makes it possible for us to live with hope in the midst of our own storms, and to rejoice and to give thanks that our God would do and has done anything and everything to get us home, even dying on a cross so that we might know that there is no storm, not even the storm of death, that God's love won't come and lead us through and bring us safely home. The reading from Acts that we heard this morning, it refers to the ascension of Jesus. It said, when he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. The church celebrates the ascension of Jesus 40 days after Easter, which was this past Thursday. And when we come to the ascension, it marks the beginning of what I would call an in-between time. The time between the ending of Jesus' earthly ministry and the time when Jesus will return, when Jesus will come again. It is during this in-between time that we are called to live our lives. Guided by the Holy Spirit, which Jesus promised he would send us, and what we will celebrate next Sunday on the Feast of Pentecost, guided by the Holy Spirit, the work that you and I are called to as followers of Jesus is the exact same thing that that father was doing for his son as they made their way home during that storm. Our calling as followers of Jesus is to help others to experience the presence of God's saving love in the storms that come up in their lives. Because here's the thing. Even after that very first Easter with the discovery of the empty tomb, storms are still a part of life. The death and resurrection of Jesus, as much as we might want it to, the death and resurrection of Jesus doesn't change the fact that there are going to be storms in our lives. We are going to have challenges in our lives. There are going to be tragedies and sorrows and hardships and struggles that we all face. Storms are going to be very much a part of the life that we live. Pandemics will still come and go and will still rage around us. Doctors will still sometimes have to give bad news to their patients. People in this world will still be going to bed hungry. Families will still find themselves grieving the death of loved ones. The death and resurrection of Jesus does not, as much as we might want it to, does not mean that there will be no more storms in our lives. What Jesus offers is a promise that makes it possible for us to see beyond the storms, to see beyond the reality of the storm, to a God who loves us enough to come to us in the midst of those storms, to see the possibility of a God who loves us enough to come to us and wrap his eternal arms around us and whisper deep into our souls, "I love you. We're going to make it. I know the way home." The storm is still raging, but in the presence of God's love, the power of the storm has been destroyed. There will still be storms, but because of God's love, those storms don't have to cause us to be afraid. They lose their power because we know and we trust that God's love will be present with us. So again, our Christian life and our work, our Christian life and our work during this in-between time is really to strive to be the hands and the feet of Jesus in the world today. Empowered by the Holy Spirit, we are called to be the ones who enter into the storms that others are experiencing in their lives, and to help them to know and to experience the presence of God's love that has the power to lead them safely through it and lead them safely home. So what might that look like during the storm of this pandemic? It's the simple things. It's taking the time to call someone you know is struggling, just to let them know you're thinking about them. It's showing appreciation for those who are working on the front lines. It is being extra patient and kind with people, being generous and giving to those who really are hurting, simply choosing to stay home. I've been hearing story after story on the news. I heard a story about this one person who was a baker and used her gifts to make cupcakes and was delivering cupcakes to hospitals and long-term care homes and delivering it to healthcare workers as a sign of appreciation. That is proclaiming God's love in the midst of a storm. I heard this morning another story of someone who's been printing signs and selling signs that say, stay safe and stay kind. Stay safe and be kind. And people can buy these signs for $20 and hang them in their windows to remind us how to treat one another during this time that we're in. But all proceeds of that are being given to the London Food Bank. That too is an expression of God's love in the presence of this storm. So many different ways, so many simple ways that we can wrap our arms around one another and remind each other that it's okay, that God's love is present with us, that God's love is leading us through this storm and will lead us safely home. The reality is that sometimes it rains in our lives. And when it does, you and I are called to be people, you and I are called to help people to see a greater reality, that God really does love them enough to come to them, that God really does love them enough to be present with them in the midst of the raging winds and the pouring down rain and the fears that we experience, that God's love is present with them and God's love will lead them safely home. And for that we say, thanks be to God.